Hello and welcome. Welcome. Today is our third installment or segment of the MetaCulture Studio Conversations. Um, I'm really happy to have my guest, Mike Oghia, who I've known for at least 8 years now. But, I'm guessing people are still coming in, so I will give it a couple of minutes. Meanwhile, if you're already here, I would encourage you to get set for a really deliberative, slow, and yet lively conversation. And I'm trying to make these conversations a little different from the kind of stuff you normally see, but more about that later. For the moment, I would like to just say that I'm really excited about today, mainly because Mike and I go back to 2013 when he came and worked with me in Bangalore with MetaCulture for 2 years. Some of you know about MetaCulture, but for the many who don't, I have a slightly scripted short statement that I'd like to read out. Some of you probably know MetaCulture as a conflict management center that I started in 2005 in Bangalore, India. Having started in 2005, and in a few years, I started becoming very concerned about what I saw to be the deteriorating liberal world order. And kind of almost naturally or organically, I found myself using every opportunity with clients as well as friends, or anytime I got a public platform, alerting people to these dangers to liberal secular societies. Now, it's obvious, when you look at the current state of India, the US, and many parts of the world, that my attempts failed miserably. And I'm happy to take responsibility for that. Eventually, in 2017, in January of 2017, I left India because India had become completely hostile to any genuine work built upon liberal values and principles. Just for the record, without liberal democracies, those ideas that we love so much about peace, equality, and justice would be irrelevant. And I would say that even a conversation like today's MetaCulture Studio conversation would be impossible. For that matter, without liberal democracy, you can give up on protesting the government's actions, reading your favorite author, or even talking candidly amongst friends. Those lovely folks in China, Saudi Arabia, and UAE will tell us what is permissible. Think about that for a moment. Well, since 2017, from my home office in Washington, D.C., I've been trying to educate people about what I see as our existential and civilizational crisis. This is unlike any other crisis I have experienced in the past 62 years of my life. So, amongst the things that MetaCulture does, we run Demo Sapien courses, organize conversations, make videos, create posters, and I would encourage you to go to our website and take a look at this. And Sri will put up our website on the screen towards the end of the show. Just so you know, the MetaCulture Studio, and you're right now listening to the MetaCulture Studio, is an attempt to go back to the basic foundation that undergirds all social activities. I would like to say that civilization itself is dependent on the capacity of ordinary people to have warm and intelligent conversations. I don't know about you, but I am tired of arguments, opinions being bandied about, and angry people trying to beat upon each other. Here at MetaCulture Studios, we are not trying to persuade or even excite you. We are trying to model what gentle but meaningful conversations might look like. For each segment, I invite someone very special, not because he is a famous writer or she is a brilliant scientist. My guests are here because they are sincere thinkers and good conversationists. So today, I'd like to introduce um, my friend and colleague, Mike Oghia, who is joining us from Belgrade. Mike, how are you?
I'm good. I'm excited. I'm happy that even though after a very long day, I'm still quite energized. And I think this is actually one of the things that has really gotten me through today. Just looking forward to this call. And by the way, that is a very, very overly kind introduction of me. And I really appreciate that, Ashok.
Can you give the group some sense of your background? Who are you? Where did you grow up? And why do you do what you do?
Yeah, of course. And so, well, let me think about where to start. And one thing to kind of stress to the audience, anybody who's listening, is that this is not scripted. So if I'm ever kind of, let me think about it, I am literally sitting here thinking about it. So, well, I guess the first thing to say, especially, well, let's put it this way. I was born in the US to Syrian Lebanese parents who themselves are their own identity crisis because they're basically my entire family has always been identified by migration. We've always, every generation's ended up in a different place. And it's interesting that I carry on that mantle. So I grew up in Kentucky, rural Kentucky, not even in a city of all places. And throughout my not even young adult life, my adolescence, it was really 9/11 was a huge kind of event for me. That's whenever I discovered that I was Arab, really. You know, especially growing up in a very homogenous white society and rural. You know, you don't really think much about it. Yeah, we had weird food, but we didn't really have any. You know, it was not that big of a deal. But so after a while, decided that I would really be interested after I finished university. I wanted to explore who I was more. I moved to Lebanon. I spent 3 years in Lebanon, which is where my mom grew up. And then, of course, after Lebanon, I spent, it was actually a year and a half in India, though it seemed like it was much, much more, where I, of course, worked with you before I moved to Turkey. And in Turkey, I worked as a journalist. I'm sorry, not as a journalist, as a copy editor. Big difference. I was not on the front lines at any point in time. But now I live in Belgrade. I've been here for some time. I work over the past 5 years. I've been focusing on internet governance, on digital policy, and media development. And so that's where my kind of work background intersects with this conversation. But aside from that, I mean, in the end, I'm a human. I'm a sapien, and I try to be a wiser one, but I'm not really. It's always a challenge to get there.
A work in progress.
Absolutely.
You know, it's like a long time ago, I would say even 30 years ago, I became very suspicious of anyone who claimed to be a wise person, anyone who claimed to be a philosopher, anyone who claimed even to be an artist. Because for me, somehow those terms are extraordinarily profound labels that one doesn't have the right to place on oneself. If the world, or if even one other person sees you as wise, as an artist, and I mean artist not as someone who can draw, but as someone who has an artistic sensibility, these terms must come from without. In other words, others must recognize this in you. So again, thank you for being here. And your background makes today's conversation so much more apropos. Today, we are going to be talking about identity, community, roots, and the digital world that we live in.
Mm.
And you and I, like many others, are migrants or have been immigrants at some point in our time. I remember Salman Rushdie was the first person I read who mentioned the idea that all of us and he was talking about the late 20th century,
Mm.
we are all immigrants, even if we haven't left our cities, because the cities have changed and we are no longer living in the homelands that we grew up in. If either we left our hometowns or the hometowns changed and left and
Mm.
have been replaced with something else. His book was a collection of essays, one of my favorite books by him. It was called Imaginary Homelands. So my question, and I'd like to start our conversation off with this question, Mike, and I'm going to make it a little difficult for you because you and I trust each other.
Sure.
Mike, what are some ways in which you have been disadvantaged by your constant mobility, by your having left that
Mm.
rural part of Kentucky? Even if you are at a wonderful point in your life, I'm curious about how you have been disadvantaged. What have you lost, Michael?
That's a good question. It's one that that I can answer a lot better now that my life has, let's say, settled down quite a bit, because it's interesting because I've been thinking about this question more lately, because for the longest time, especially when you met me, my life was all about discovery. It was about trying to understand. Understand in the sense of trying to get to that point of, like, what is my narrative? What makes sense? How do I create some sense out of this kind of, I don't want to call it chaos. That is, I mean, that's way too dramatic. It's just more like, how do I make sense of what has been given to me? But of course, especially when we're younger, we tend to very much live in the present, live in the moment. Okay, great. But then now I'm 32. I'll be 33 in August. I got married in 2019. And of course, now certain things, let's start at a let's say a more basic level. Basic because this is something that most people can relate to. It's not necessarily profound. Something that I've discovered is that, well, okay, I say that I have a community because I have many, many close friends all over the world. Yeah, I can go anywhere practically, and there will be somebody that will have a couch ready for me, or perhaps if I'm lucky, a spare room or something. So there has been undoubtedly a lot of benefits to my moving around, to my kind of on-the-go lifestyle. But now I also recognize that if my wife Andrea, her and I, let's say on a very basic level, we want to have a kid, if we wanted to. They say it takes a community. They say it takes a village to raise a child, right? Well, where's our village? Our village is in cyberspace, but that's not the same as having somebody to come to your house or to your flat and help you when you're tired with a child, or raise them or instill with them values or whatnot. So that, at a very, very kind of basic level, is something that I've recognized, that it's one thing to have friends, it's one thing to have people, it's another thing to really be like, who is my clan, who is my tribe, in a certain way. So I recognize that is something that I don't have, even if, again, I have very close friends in the world, kind of littered around the place. So that's one. Number two is that I identify as what's called a third culture kid. So that's basically the combination of two cultures that you were grown up in. So in this case, I say my two cultures were Syrian and Lebanese combined with rural American culture, and that's created a very hybrid model with me that has obviously been sprinkled with Lebanon and Turkey and India and Southeast Europe and all kinds of other things. So I recognize that something, looking back especially, I don't really have a sense of rootedness. My rootedness is in my narrative, and that's incredibly tenuous.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's something that I have now, but if I'm always paving the road ahead of me, I
Mm.
don't actually know where it's leaving until I get there.
Well, what a
It's leading.
powerful image. What a powerful image. So, since you mentioned, and that was also a very important connection you made about your future child and the lack of a village or a lack of a community to raise the child. When you go back to your own childhood, what how did you experience community when you were growing up? Because in um my understanding of America now, my experience of America is mostly urban America, but my understanding of America is that even in rural Americas, I mean rural communities, it is possible not to have too much of a community, because if people lived in farms or in homesteads that were separated by miles from
Yeah,
their neighbor, then it's entirely possible you were reliant only on your parents. So
yeah.
what was it like for you? Did you have a community over and above your nuclear family when you were growing up?
Well, so let me start here. My immediate family, sorry, aside from I have two siblings, and obviously I had my two parents. My mom's side of the family that was in the United States was in California, and my dad's side of the family was in New York. So I barely saw my relatives, to be honest. I didn't meet my Lebanese family until I moved to Lebanon. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to go there. So I never really had a strong sense of family connection, to be honest, outside of the nuclear family. The community itself, I mean, I actually divide my childhood into kind of two parts. The first part, I grew up in one place, and then when I was about 10, we moved to another place that was even more rural and more, let's say, distanced. Where I grew up, or the first place where I grew up, it was a very kind of typical small town community. You know, we had my family is Catholic, so we had our church, and it's very typical in that sense. And we're part of that, and I had my friends in the neighborhood, and it was, houses were close by to each other, so we
Lovely.
could actually go to each other. When we moved to Eastern Kentucky, which is in the mountains, it's incredibly rural. It's known for its rural nature. We didn't. The neighbors were far apart. You had to have a car to go anywhere. There were no sidewalks unless you're in the very center of town. I mean, it's very spacious, but
Mm.
and we didn't really. I mean, I had some friends in high school and that sort of thing, but I didn't really have many people. In fact, that was one of the things that technology brought at the time. I mean, we had dial-up internet, but I could play games online, which was a huge thing for me. I was able to, and that for me was like socializing, let's say.
Yeah, this is
Yeah, go ahead,
fascinating, and if you don't mind my interrupting, because I
please.
want to capture something that you said,
Uh,
the introduction of dial-up internet and
mm,
how it changed for people who might otherwise be isolated. Now, I'm sure, kind of like you, but in the late 90s or mid to late 90s, there was so much of hype and beyond hype, positivity and optimism about how the internet was going to connect everyone and everything. And it was going to create this global village. One of my heroes, Marshall McLuhan,
mm,
was the one who coined the term global
mhm.
village way back in the 60s, way before anyone ever thought of the internet. And he talked about it in terms of electronic technology. The word digital did not even arise at that point in time. He was talking about what elect- electronic technology would do to us as individuals and us as a species. And he likened electronic technology to our extending our nervous system
Yes.
across the planet, across the planet. In other
Yeah.
words, we would be able to sense what was happening anywhere else in the world, not because we can see it, not because we can touch it, but our nerves would be all across the world. And in a sense, the internet is the extension of our nervous system. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, so
It's an
for me,
extension of our consciousness. Absolutely.
exactly. And today, very few people talk about the internet as creating this global village. Now, I know we have the usual reasons why, because of polarization, because of the kind of algorithms that Facebook and Google and everyone else uses, and because of social media bubbles.
Yeah.
We don't have that sense of a global community. If anything, we have a very fragmented sense of us. So, my question to you is, what happened, man? What happened?
Well, I mean, first of all, Ashok, let's start at the basics. We've never been a global community, so why would
Right.
one new piece of technology change that? And you know, there's a book that I really like. If you're talking about books, there's the guy that writes now. Well, there's an author. Sorry, he's not he's a guy, but yeah, but he's an author. He writes for The Economist now, and his name is Tom Standage, and he has a book. Oh, there we go. There we go. He has a book that I love. It's called The Victorian Internet. And the thesis of this book, the TLDR, the too long didn't read, is that, and I do encourage anybody to read it who is interested, is that the telegraph was actually just as, if not more, revolutionary than the internet, because that was the first time that humanity ever really had what would be considered, you know, it's not instantaneous per se, but let's say rapid communication, really rapid communication. The internet is just an iteration of existing technologies, not just one, but many. And so the idea that this new technology is just going to be incredibly revolutionary, it was you know, kind of, it was doomed to fail from the start, because first of all, I mean, it's changed the world in many ways, but it didn't necessarily make mass broadcasting, didn't necessarily make everything instantly better or whatnot. It just changes things. It creates an additional layer of complexity. And guess who I learned that from? You know, and it's like, it's the idea that we cannot just, I mean, this is something I've learned. If something is inherently complex, you know, we tried to invent our ways out of that complexity, but we end up making it even more complex. So it's like, if we go back to the basis of your question, what happened? Well, we were always tribal. We were always kind of othering. We were always trying to create a sense. This goes back to our basic biology of difference, of othering, of, you know, you and me versus us and them, or whatever. So the idea that, oh, we can't, you know, one little bit of technology or this group of technologies is automatically going to make everything better, that's completely flawed assumption to begin with. And that's the problem. There was all these flawed assumptions that were then put on steroids by capitalism. And what I mean, sorry, because I don't want to say that the commercialization of the internet was a terrible thing. It had many positive impacts. However, it's a lot easier to take advantage of the idealism when you know that you're going to become the next billionaire because you made an app and you sold it to Facebook. You know? So there's a lot of interest there. Now, I think a good kind of way to anchor this to our conversation, instead of me just belaboring this point, I have a question for you as well. And this is something to me that goes back to the global village, which is kind of such a quaint, I think is the right word. It's such a quaint concept now in retrospect, global village. You know, yes, I can communicate with my parents who are literally on the other side of the world instantaneously. That is incredible. We can have this conversation. That is incredible. But at the same time, if we're talking about what are the trade-offs, a question that I've been thinking of is, how does the kind of connectivity that we have, that the internet really enables, how does it impact our ability to commit and be fully engaged within our present surroundings? I think that question really hits at the gist of what you're trying to get to. Kind of, if I can be anywhere, why am I ever where I am? Does that make sense?
Can you frame it as a question for me? Because what you're saying resonates with me, but I don't feel any responsibility to answer it. So is there a question for me?
Well, I guess, yeah. I mean, I suppose the question is kind of, what does being present look like? And if we adapt that to technology, if my presence can be beamed anywhere in the world, is there really such a thing anymore as community, or as roots, or as being local? Does that even exist anymore? Is that a good way of framing it?
Okay, so yeah, thank you. But I want to just pick up on what you just asked now, but also link it to a couple of things. I totally get the idea that the telegraph was the first way of extending our ideas or our messages, and thereby ourselves, across distance, in a way that even the tom-toms or the drums in jungles couldn't quite, or the smoke signals were very primitive versions of those. But the telegraph did it in a very systematic, institutionalized way. And I get that the internet is a far more sophisticated telegraphing system. So that's one.
Yeah.
I want to make a connection between that and something that happened to me in 1982. I remember this because for 6 months, I don't even want to go into the details of this, but I spent a wretched 6 months living in someone's house in Kuwait, waiting for a visa to come to the UAE. Now, don't even, when I think about years wasted, I mean, I think of that point in my life. But for whatever reason, I was living with this lovely couple, who were friends of my parents, lovely couple, but very conservative. They were from North India, and they were beautiful and warm-hearted to have me stay with them, live with them in a small one-bedroom apartment. I was on the couch for 6 months. And every day they would watch 3 to 4 Bollywood films every day in the living room, which was small and which was where I slept. Their entire recreation, other than they played bridge once a week, other than bridge, was watching Bollywood movies. It got so terrible, because, as you know, Bollywood movies, particularly of that era,
they're so long.
They are long and they're loud, and the fighting and the music and the dancing, and it was like I was feeling assaulted, and I would try to retreat into a book. And this lovely lady, I called her auntie, she would say, Ashok, she would admonish me. She would say, Ashok, that is so antisocial. You're not watching the movie with me. When you read that book, and I would say, but auntie, I don't have a problem with your watching the movie. I don't want to. And, imagine 6 months into 4 movies a day. Okay.
Sorry, Ashok, that sounds like torture. No offense.
Hey,
I'm
I get
not
it, but
huge
that's for you
Bollywood
and
fan,
me.
to be honest.
That's for you and me, Mike.
Yeah.
It was absolutely the thing to do from where she was coming from. And my need to read was seen as my being extraordinarily antisocial. Guess why? Guess why? Very quickly. Why do you think she felt so offended by my reading?
Well, I would interpret it as kind of like in-group, out-group. We're watching television.
Right.
You're being on your own.
But why? Why?
Did she feel threatened that you were expanding your knowledge?
No. So let me. This is my understanding, and I did have a few conversations with her and others later. When you are watching a television or you're listening to the radio in a room and not through headphones,
Right.
but that TV image fills the whole room. The sound fills the whole room. And if there are three people and two of them are watching that and they are in the moment in that film, it's a collective experience. The
Right.
moment I retreat into a book, I am basically withdrawing myself from their collective experience and I am getting into a textual bubble. I am basically telling them, your community is distasteful for me. I do not wish to have anything to do with that. I am going to shut myself off, wear a burqa in terms of the text, in terms of the book. And she felt, here's this guy. We were so good to him. We put him up for 6 months. We fed him. And he doesn't want to be part of us. And the reason why I say this, the reason why I share this with you, Mike, is the internet is me in that room on
Mm.
steroids. The
Oh yeah.
internet allows me to not even be in the room. I mean, I can be anywhere. I have nothing at all anymore to share with that lovely couple. And this, for me, is the most devastating change. I still want to hold on to the idea that it's a change and not a tragedy, because I want us to explore this and
Mhm.
not start this conversation with uh, having written off the idea of community coming out of the digital world we live in. But imagine from a book, which, I mean, McLuhan talks about this, and
Mhm.
Gutenberg, in his book
Yeah.
Gutenberg Galaxy, he talks about the fact that what changed tribal societies, what changed feudalistic societies, what changed the medieval world was that we escaped from oral storytelling. We escaped from collective music into the pages of a book where our experience of the world was no longer the world around us or no longer dictated by the stories told around us. It was by getting into the mind of someone who might have been 2,000 miles away. So
Mm.
what started with the text in terms of removing us from our immediacy, our
Mm.
presence in the present, what changed with the internet is it completely fragmented human experience. You don't even have a physical book to hold
Yeah.
on to.
Right.
You are living in ether. And people like you and me today, even though I see myself as really a Luddite, I spent 80% of my daily life, of my day, particularly in the time of COVID, on the
Yeah.
net.
The irony is, if anybody listening in doesn't know Ashok, even just 8 years ago, he was the biggest anti-technology, not even Luddite. Luddite is more like somebody who just doesn't know how to use it. You were, Ashok, you were anti-technology. You were like, why do we have to do this digitally? Why do we have to have a digital calendar? I remember you got mad at me once because I was scheduling all my appointments on the calendar, and you were like, no, I'm going to give you a diary. And you know what? I still use a paper diary to this day. I use both, but like I like to make a to-do list on paper. That was from you. The fact is, you have become now, we have switched roles. I barely even use social media anymore. Now you're like this social media wizard. And I find that change, even that you have exemplified, to be
How
an
the mighty
interesting one.
have fallen.
Well, it just goes to show that change is always possible, I
Well,
suppose. But
actually, I have to make sure I justify myself here
yeah,
because
yeah.
I hate it. If there's one technology that I detest, it's digital technology. But
Mm,
The work that I do, because as you, and you know, I am completely committed to the work I do. I am so terrified about where the world is going that because I don't get funding, I don't have any resources. Most of the people who attend my courses, I give them scholarship. I don't have a choice. I have to use social media to
Yeah,
even get across to a small fraction of the people out there. I use it under duress. So, but that aside, I mean, it is useful for me. It is convenient for me. It allows me to get the so-called word out. And I don't regret that. But if I were to if I had the opportunity to pick and choose
of
what would
course.
be good for humanity, I would never pick digital technology
No,
in all its manifestations. But
this is
coming,
you
sorry,
adapting. This is
I'm
you
adapt.
adapting. It's not
I'm
adapting to you. And that's,
well,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well,
So coming back to this idea of
yeah,
community, let me go back to your family. By that I mean your wife Andrea, and let's just
sure.
assume you will have a child. When you now and you are not only seeped like I am in the digital world, you work on the internet. I mean, this is your life. So
It
here's my
is.
question: what would family mean for you once you have your child in this kind of a digital environment? What does family mean when it's basically you, Andrea, and Mike or Andrea Jr.? What would family mean?
To be honest, I don't know. I don't know because I feel like I'm still trying to figure that out. Because it's again, there's no. The irony is I've thought so much about this question, Shok. I honestly have. And my of course my parents, I love them so much. I love them to death. They're great people. They're of course, for them, they're just like, when are we gonna have a grandkid? When's a grandkid coming along? Of course, they would love for us to be grandparents. And then I've said to my mom in the past, I'm like, okay, you become a grandma. It's like, when would you see your grandchild? Once a
Mm,
year? Twice a year, if you're lucky. It's like it. And by saying that, I don't mean to put her down. I don't mean to say, get off my ass. I mean to say, I mean to almost highlight how different the how different our expectations of life have become in just literally a generation. And given we're a long generation, what I mean by that is that my mom and dad are baby boomers, millennial, but obviously there's Generation X and now there's the Generation Z and whatnot. But the point is, I'm only saying that because in the social expectations of what my mom and dad grew up with and what I grew up with are different in almost every single way, culturally, socially. If we think about the quote unquote the zeitgeist of what is happening internationally, where we are with technology, it's so different. And so if you ask me what does family look like? Let's say if let's say we had a kid in 5 years. Um, on the one hand, it's more daily video calls. It's the way that my cousins do it. It's a daily call. It's frequent air travel. It's yeah, I suppose it's making the time, activating the networks, but that is based on an assumption that COVID has completely undermined. The assumption that everything will be the same and we can plan for that based on that. And that is just not the case. And as climate change worsens, for instance, um, as more of our life is online, to me, family won't just be the blood relatives that I have, which I love and I appreciate, but it will be the community that Andrea and I define. Now that is completely, I want to be very clear. We are privileged to be able to do that. Most people, I mean, I'm privileged in every element of my life. Let's be frank. But most people do not have the freedom to choose who their family is. And when I say who their family is, I mean who their close bonds are. Most people, it's the people that they grow up with. It's the people in their tribe. It's the people in their caste, their community. In
I
that
want
sense.
to just twist that a little, Mike.
Please.
Uh, you say you're privileged because you can choose the people you are close to. And at the same time, we started this conversation with your saying, and it was really the way you framed it was really beautiful, that you are you are building your path as you are traversing it. In other
Mm.
words, you don't have roots anymore. And
No.
I'm like you.
Yeah.
And so for me, bear with me a couple of minutes here, but
Please.
because this is very troubling for me.
Mm.
I changed countries 5 times. I don't mean travel, to
You're
immigrate
right.
5 times. I also changed professions 5 times. And I have lived in so many cities and so many houses that I literally have, with each move, I have hacked away at my roots. This has given me extraordinary freedom. I'm not kidding. When I look at most Americans, they're not as free as I am in
I know
terms
what you
of
mean.
not just mobility, but in terms of my capacity to do what I want to.
Mm-hmm.
I fashioned myself this way from a very early age. And even as I celebrate my independence and my freedom, I realize that in a way, I have become a rump of a human being because in losing those roots, in losing those bonds, in losing those close neighbors, close friends from high school or college, or not having anything except the most peripheral relationships with people I love dearly, my uncles and my aunts and my nephews and my nieces. Uh, Despite my having all that affection for them, I am not at all in their lives, and they are
Mm-mm.
not in mine. And when I look at the trade off here, the my freedom, my being able to live what for me is a life of integrity, has been at the cost of completely sacrificing family, community, and roots. And yeah, I just wanted to share that because the internet has not even remotely bridged that gap for me. Not at all. Most of the internet, most of social media for me is connecting with people I didn't know who now I have access to. And some of those people, I'm delighted to connect with people through my courses. I'm delighted to meet really fascinating people. But all of those connections are, as you said, I am putting little steps in front of me to move down, move into my future. The
Yeah.
past has almost become utterly irrelevant. I can't think of anything more
Yes.
tragic.
It's oh my gosh. Okay, so now you're hitting on something that's really interesting to me. A couple things I can pick out from that I've written down. One is that the irony of the American, or not just the American, but it's of course it's emphasized by the United States because of freedom. It's what our brand is or whatever. But of course there's, for almost every sovereign state that emphasizes a sense of quote unquote liberal democracy. I mean, freedom is part of that self-determination, let's say. Freedom, often when we say freedom, we mean self-determination, but it's not just because there's no such thing as absolute freedom. Of course not. There's always constraints, but with this emphasis on freedom, it's what they don't tell you. They don't tell you to they don't let you read the fine print. And the fine print is that with the more freedom you have, there are always trade-offs. And especially in a world now that emphasizes the individual over all else, it really, you think, this collective bullshit, like, why do I have to think about this? Why do I have to think about my community or whatnot? It's not just about the social capital that comes with having a sense of bonds. It's a sense of also having, I suppose, meaning. And what I mean by that is it's interesting you said that your past is largely irrelevant. I can relate to that on a level that's really scary for me, to be honest. It's scary because I've been really feeling my mortality lately. I don't know if it's COVID. I don't know if it's because I've been stuck in basically this room for the past almost a year and a half. I listen to songs, and I think I look at the date on it. I'm like 2005. I'm like, oh, that was almost 20 years ago, or something. I'm like, whoa. I wasn't a kid then. I mean, yeah, I was, but I was a senior in high school. I was in my last year, so I was like, I'm feeling a sense that time is running out, even though I still have comparatively a lot ahead of me. Hopefully, touch wood. I suppose. But I feel a sense of, wait, all of that is gone and I'll never get it back. And so it makes me think that my most important resource that I have, especially as somebody who's thankfully financially independent and financially comfortable, is that time is the one resource we can never get more of, no matter how rich we are, no matter how enlightened we are, no matter what. Everything comes to an end. Stars and galaxies die one day. Even the most powerful entities that we know in the entire, even black holes dry up. So it's like, it's interesting to me that when I think about what I invest in, it is the people who I still have a very close relationship today over a 10-year period, let's say. That's what I think of as being the most important and valuable, for lack of better words, possession in my life. It's not material. It's these relationships that I've been able to forge because I can't go back in time. I can't do it again.
I want to question those relationships, Mike.
Please.
I know, the work we do. I mean, when you were at MetaCulture and even otherwise, I think both of us really value relationships. I've made a career out of them, particularly in the last 30 years. And I want to come back to the question that was there on the flyer, which is, how does the internet and social media affect romantic relationships? Let's just take one kind of relationships. And one of the things that I realize, and for myself, and I see this in pretty much anyone that I encounter today, that urbanization, even before the internet, urbanization and globalization have affected relationships because we are all so much more mobile. And the thing about relationships is relationships come under pressure when you're not in the same place. So for instance, even in a family of 5 in the 60s or 70s that lived together was a very different kettle of fish than a family of 5 or 4 where one of the children was sent off to boarding school for a few months at a time. So the moment, and the same thing goes with neighbors. If you have a neighbor that you've spent 10 years with, 20 years with, the relationship that you have is very different from the kind of neighbor you have in a condo. And I'm not even referring to the fact that most of us don't even know who our neighbors are in large apartment buildings. But when you say, and I like to think this too, that many of my friendships are really deep and meaningful, I sometimes wonder whether I'm kidding myself, because I'm never there for them unless they want to vent on a phone call or a Zoom call, unless I show up in their city for a business trip and I take them out for dinner. I am not there for any of my friends. I'm not there today for any of my family. And here's the thing, when we look at romance, and I take this only because it's one kind of relationship that has gotten an enormous amount of attention, not just from popular media, but also from academics and therapists and everyone else. And one of the things I realize, and I'm probably more culpable of this than many other people today, our sense of freedom, um, individual autonomy, the need to self-determine our path, makes or changes what romance is and was historically. Romance historically in every society, even those societies which essentially had arranged marriages, the idea of romance was to be able to, through attraction, build a bond with someone so that you could carry your genes and your culture across to the next generations. It romance was rooted in that particular culture. Today, the idea of romance seems to be itself a transient idea. Can you speak to that?
It's a big question. And I feel like let me ask you, can I clarify something with you? How would you like for me to answer this? Do you mean like in a meta sense, or in a,
no.
just based on my opinion?
So
My
here's the
experience?
thing. For us to keep this at a real level,
Mm,
and that's one of the things I try to do with the studio conversations. I am I think it's useful if we talked about ourselves and our experiences rather than at a technical, philosophic, or metaphysical level without naming third party people, because we don't have the right to talk about someone we know. But so when I look at romance, all the people, now I went to college in the 70s and early 80s. Almost everyone who fell in love with someone in those years, they got married, they had children, and 90% of them are still together. They, other than the fact that, like the rest of us, because of globalization, urbanization, and everything else, we've been scattered. But there was a way in which the romance was an attempt at strengthening the larger family, strengthening the larger community. Today's romance seems completely divorced from community, divorced from the larger extended family, divorced from society itself. I can marry whoever I want. I can stay married, or I can live with whoever I want, and I can stop living with the person at any point in time. And and my falling in love and being in love with someone almost has no connection with the family or the community. That's how do you see this playing out? Um, how do you see this playing out in your extended friendships?
It's interesting because I was just mentioning to Andrea today that it's like, yeah, it seems like everybody I know is getting married now, or everybody I know is married now, with very few exceptions. Um, hmm. The irony is that because I know so many different kinds of people who have so many different kinds of lives, I certainly see some of, let's say, the community elements influencing their relationships, whether it be they have certain commonalities that you might say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like they're like this, they're like that, and I don't mean commonalities like they like the same movie. I mean, like they speak the same language, they have the same ideals of what it means to be, what same values, that sort of thing. So in that sense, and if I think it's incredible that we have been able to expand our repertoire, or no, sorry, that's not the right way of putting it. We've been able to expand our horizons in terms of who is out there, because in the past too, it's been, in the past now, it's many people. There's a sense that, yeah, you stay within the community.
So
It's interesting, Ashok, and I'm sorry, I just want to say, like, I feel like there's so many different kinds of people and communities out there that it's again, I don't mean to.
no problem, but I'm
Yeah.
gonna say
Please.
something that all of this, for me, when we talk of romance, when we talk of community today, it feels as though we are catering at the lowest common denominator. Because, as you said, our range of options has increased. You can date anyone you want, unless you're living in a very conservative society, of course. I'm talking of most of us who are urbanized, mobile, and everything else. But let me let me talk about my own experience. In the last, I've been with Stacy for 5 years now. She lived with me in India for a year.
Mm.
She met very few of my relatives, but has met a few relatives in the US. I know her parents well, and I've met a few of her relatives. We come from totally different backgrounds. And our being a modern couple has meant that Stacy does not need to fit in or even understand my community at all. She does not have to have a relationship with a single cousin or aunt or uncle of mine. And
Ashok,
because I meet her parents once in a while, yes, I do get along. They're lovely people, but I don't need to have a relationship with a single relative of hers. And this, for me, it's almost as though the modern romance is unmoored. There is no anchor at all for it. I'm not asking you a question. I'm just sharing with you what I see. And I want to move to a couple of other questions now, because we are getting a lot of questions. And thank you, Pilar, for highlighting the question on romance. Uday has asked a question. If both of you have worked face-to-face as well as on social media, which mode of communication has produced more meaningful, sustainable outcomes for you and others? I just, I have a talent for pissing off all the people who like me. And the ones who don't like me, it's completely understandable. I piss off not only people who like me, but people who sometimes go to the extent of respecting me by challenging the very thing that they seem to like in what I do. So, since September of 2019, a year and a half now, I have been running the Demo Sapien courses. We don't have much of a range, so I can't advertise very much. We don't have institutional support, but we are able to attract a small group every time. And very soon I find in every batch people saying, "Oh, I love this community. I like coming back to this community." And I tell them very clearly, be under no illusions. This is not a community. And for me, I am under duress using Zoom. I would much rather I met you face to face in a room, and we had day-long sessions, and we had lunch together and tea and coffee. And at the end of the session, we walked to a cafe or a bar and sat and talked. And that perhaps after the course, you came and visited me at home. For me, that's where the learning happens. Even as a teacher, that is where the learning happens. I find that the internet or e-learning structure is so disembodied that even if people like what I do, I am so conscious of how superficial it is. Remember, the work I do is about how people think. I'm not teaching computer skills. I'm not teaching about civics, how democracy works. I'm not trying to mobilize people to give money for a cause or to overthrow the oppressive patriarchy. I am trying to get people to really understand about reality. And in order to do that, we have to understand the ways in which our minds work, our own sociocentricity and our egocentricity. I'm trying to get people to transcend that. And in that, I have to confess that any technology which mediates between me as a teacher or me as a student with others in that classroom only weakens it. Even if during COVID, this has been good for my work. So
Potentially
I just,
inevitable.
what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, of course, to be frank, Ashok, the first thing that I have to ask you to clarify is then, how do you define community? It's such a simple question,
Absolutely.
but you have to answer it.
So here's the thing. One of the things I do in my courses is ask people to go back to the roots and the authentic meanings of words. For me, if words are not completely understood, if we dilute the meaning of words, if we, in a sense, make them less sacred, if a word means more than one thing, and if tomorrow it means 20 things, essentially what we are doing is making that word impotent. And we are taking away everything that was magical about the word. Now, so for me, community is one such word. It meant connection to people who were important for you, both kith and kin. It meant, as you use the word clan, it meant that people were dependent on each other, that there was interdependence. And without that interdependence, and I don't mean just showing up at 10 o'clock for my courses. And, I appreciated that people show up, and that's a commitment. So we are dependent on each other showing up. That is the most superficial of commitments. It's like showing up for a football game. It's like stopping at the traffic light when it's red. We are all stopping at the traffic light. If we didn't, we'd be in trouble. But none of us would say that a group of automobiles at the traffic light constitutes a community. It's a group. A community is different from a group. So community really is the basis for society. And a society is the basis for a nation or a state. If you don't have strong societies, you cannot have a strong nation. If you don't have a strong community, you cannot have a strong society, because a society is made up of multiple communities that are dependent, that are committed to each other. So the digital way in which the term community is used is a travesty. It is, I would call it blasphemous, because it destroys the very idea of what it means to be human and to live in a commune. So go on.
Well, A few things to point out here. And first of all, anybody that's listening, I'm sorry if we're not getting to your questions immediately. I mean, there's obviously so much
I
that we can
am.
talk
I
about.
am
And
actually picking up
oh,
questions. Yeah.
good. Yeah. I don't want anybody to feel left out. But I have to point something out, Ashok. So if communities are what underpin societies and societies are what underpins nations, am I
Yes.
capturing what you said? Well,
Yeah.
well, what if technology has made the concept of the nation archaic?
It
What
is.
if,
It has.
and
Oh,
so then
absolutely. It has.
if we're living, if we're running 21st century 21st century society on 18th or 19th century hardware, software, as an author that I really like, Gideon Lichfield, says, then is the problem that our structures, our social structures, our political structures, are they too unable to actually adapt to the kind of change that technology is facilitating?
Great point. Great point. And this, for me, is one of the reasons why we will never solve this problem, because we are putting the uh, mythical or conceptual cart before the horse.
Mm.
Throughout human history, the emphasis of any society has been safety, security, and continuity. This is why family, this is why community, this is why society, even nations, are developed the way they did and came to us in the mid 20th century the way they are. Until this point, despite whatever technologies happened, the family structure was intact. The neighborhood was intact. The community was intact. Throughout our species history, this was the way human beings were protected. Now, suddenly, out of nowhere, because of our ingenuity, we change the ways in which we communicate. We change the ways in which we work, the ways in which we entertain ourselves, the ways in which we make love, the ways in which we make conflict. And the internet has completely fragmented society. It has, as a teacher of critical thinking, it has destroyed the capacity of the human mind to focus enough on one idea long enough to think clearly. We are all functioning as though the mind were built of a series of hyperlinks. And that is not conducive for thinking. Now, you're right. Society has changed. The family has changed. The individual has changed. But my question to you and to everyone else is, does that mean that we need to now create structures that will work in these changed conditions, thereby legitimizing the change that has happened, legitimizing the fact that we do not need to be connected in a physical way anymore. We do not have to be committed to our neighbors, to our relatives, to our friends, and that we can function as completely isolated human beings who just happen to inhabit a physical space, and that the political structures and the family structures and the marriage structures must now change to accommodate that. That, for me, is a very dangerous step. I would go to the extent of saying that a step like that almost ensures our species extinction. We were not designed to be isolated creatures. We were not designed to be communicating with people 3,000 miles away. We were designed as a biochemical, biophysical being. We evolved as people who engage with other sentient beings and create the kind of bonds that can keep us safe. So I worry when particularly Silicon Valley and the so-called progressive thinkers want to completely do away with the basic foundations of human society in order to allow us to fit in a digital world.
So, first of all, for anybody listening, I don't want to. I neither agree nor disagree with you, Ashok. I want to be very clear about that. I think that, I mean, if we're taking a Demo sapiens lens, and I really like this concept, and for anybody who doesn't know, I was in the inaugural class of Demo sapiens, and it was fascinating. Is that, well, I mean, first of all, let's start with our hardware. If we're talking technology, our hardware was not built to sit on a chair for 12 hours and sit in front of a screen and make sense of the world in order so I can, to do what we do. We were meant to be out hunting animals and gathering and moving from one place to another. Movement, migration is just a part of the human condition as pretty much anything else is. It's always what we've done. But I guess a good way of flipping this kind of discussion a bit on its head is that, well, because of the kind of evolution of our brains, and it was you, by the way, Ashok, who really instilled brain science to me, the importance of looking at the brain as the basis of so much. It's not the individual, it's the brain itself that enables the individual to even exist. And so I think about
Mike,
it in this.
Mike, only
Yeah.
in the interest of time.
Sorry.
I want to. No. I want
forever.
I want you to make your point because there are a couple of questions I want to get to before the end of it, end of the session. But please make your point.
My point is that at the same time, we do have the capacity to evolve, and not necessarily our hardware, but our software,
Right.
and how we think, and
Right.
what we see, our cultural evolution, and I'm sure Harari has talked a lot about this in his books and whatnot. But I guess a question then is that what happens to our species if we become multiplanetary?
Right.
Are we existing? Are we living through the next step where we go from being, just like we went from, well, not necessarily like this per se, but Neanderthal to Homo sapien?
Right.
Are we going from Homo sapien to Homo galactus?
Right. So one of the things that I say is I don't want to speculate about settlements in Mars or anywhere else. I don't know enough about it, and frankly, I don't care. My concern is very simple. It's for human beings on this planet, and I care about the planet. And I worry that we are in the process of destroying both. Now, but this thing about changing the software, one of the things that people like you and me, because we are so privileged, we are the global citizens because we have no roots. We also tend to assume that because we have been able to restructure our own thinking, we have been able to adapt to extremely difficult and new conditions, 8 billion people on this planet will be able to do the same. When I go back to the evolution, human evolution, yes, we were not designed to be sitting on a chair for 8 hours. This gives us huge orthopedic problems, but that's the part. Yes, we have changed culturally. We have come a long way from our ancestors, even 200 years ago, leave alone 2,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago. But here's something that's very important. The internet and television did not affect us the way the wheel affected us or the way the printed page affected us. Those changes took hundreds of years to affect society. And even then, in some cases, the printed page took 400 years to get to certain parts of the world. There were parts of the planet which didn't see the wheel until thousands of years after it was invented somewhere else. We, including our minds, we had the advantage of adapting slowly to change.
Yes,
What
exactly.
television did is it totally changed everything. The internet didn't even ask people in a little village in India whether they were ready for it. It
No.
came there. The smartphone has totally destroyed so many things that are so crucial for a thinking human being, for a relational human being. I don't even want to start. The people in our generation, or even the young ones who are 20 today, who got their first cell phones when they were 10 or 12, within 6 months, that cell phone completely changed the way they engage with their parents. This is why I'm not confident that the changes that will take place because of technology will be for either the good, or that we will be able to change so-called human nature. We will be
We're in
able to
uncharted
change our
territory.
software. And
We're in uncharted territory.
yes, and I worry about anyone who says we need to change our political structure, we need to change our social structure in order to accommodate a technological structure that is absolutely mindless, cruel, and devastating. I know you and I, we don't agree on a couple of things. Particularly, you are more positive about technology, and while I never was, no, I know, but you are a little more open to technological society getting somewhere, a more
Not as much
humane
as I
place.
used to be. Not
Oh,
as much as
okay.
I used to be.
I take
That,
it back then. I take it back.
uh, interestingly enough, the Silicon Valley executives that built a lot of these technologies, they don't allow their kids on
I
phones.
know.
They don't allow their kids on the apps. I used to plaster my life everywhere on social media. Most people do not know anything about me anymore. A lot of people don't even know that I'm married.
Okay.
Ashok.
You become careful about what you share.
I've become careful. I value my privacy. I control my narrative. You could say it's a control issue, but it's not about that. It's more that when we're broadcasting our whole life to everyone in the world, why do I want to invite that kind of scrutiny
Right.
from people that I do not need to necessarily care about?
Right. Thank you.
And that's a difference. Yeah, sorry.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
There is another question. How does the internet destroy curiosity? Well, here's how I was curious as a child. When I was really curious how babies were made, or what was really happening in politics, or any of those questions, I had to really work my butt off to get the answers. I would very gingerly ask my
Hmm.
elders. I would ask my friends, and we would whisper about some things, and we would get very excited because it seemed scandalous. And then I would look at books, and it would take me a couple of months, if not years, to satisfy my curiosity. I lived with and I stayed curious throughout that entire period. My mind was working. Today, if I have the slightest curiosity, I go on Google, and within a couple of minutes, I know the answer. My curiosity dies. The internet has destroyed curiosity because it has made it possible to get a facsimile of an answer that satisfies my emergent confusions, my questioning. So I just want to say that is the idea that somehow the internet will open up the thinking, and children sitting in villages will start asking phenomenal questions. It is such a load of garbage, such a load of garbage. There's another question here, and before on that, we have about 10 minutes. Please put down questions. Even if these questions are not answered here, we will try to find a place where we can take many of these questions. We could probably even put up answers to this on the YouTube channel where this video is going to be posted. So
Yes.
a great
They
question.
will get answered, everyone. Don't feel like you're just sending it into the void.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Even though that's entirely possible, and I'm hoping that Mike and the others will keep me honest here. There's another question which is very interesting. How does the internet enhance or destroy the concept of identity? So this is actually a very, very powerful idea. I'm reminded again by something McLuhan said in the late 60s when he talked about the fact that electronic technology would make us so connected with people across the world that we would become disconnected from people who are closest to us. And get this, our identity comes from the people who are closest to us. Our sense of self really comes from where we are. And what people like you and me, Mike, and many others in this conversation, what we have become is almost wholly defined intentionally. In other words, I am what I do. I am my credentials. I am my taste in music or books. I am the people I am seen with at a party. And the identity.
I am my 160 character Twitter profile.
Absolutely. And the entire idea of identity has been trivialized because we don't have an identity anymore. And McLuhan talks about the fact that when you take away the identity from a human being, she becomes isolated within herself, not only within the people around her. And he warns us that when you have masses of people who do not have an identity anymore, they express themselves mainly through violence. He talks about riots, not because people are angry with services that are not delivered, even though that can be a trigger. They are burning buses and breaking shop windows and killing cops, or cops are killing other people because they're trying desperately to understand who they are, to give meaning to themselves. I have seen people on television saying, yes, we will burn these things down because they mean nothing to us. They are not a part of us. We feel isolated from City Hall. We feel isolated and not a part of the Nike showroom. We feel isolated and completely set apart from even our democratic system. Identity in the digital age is so wafer thin that we have to resort to a kind of violence to even prove to ourselves that we exist. It's like a teenager cutting herself on the wrist.
I agree to that to an extent, but I'm sorry, Ashok. I also think that's overly simplistic because people throughout history have had strong identities with whatever is a religion or a nation or all these things. And then look what they did to each other. They ended up killing each other over that too. So it makes me wonder actually more, I think humanity just has a propensity towards killing each other, especially if we disagree with one another. So that to me is almost more like,
Great point, but I want to make a distinction. You're right. We have a propensity for violence. The difference is this. Violence until now was between tribes. There was the other, and we fought against people who were different from us. What happens in a city when violence is unleashed within a community, within even a Hispanic community or a Chinese American community or a Black community? And what happens there is not always a fight with the other. It is an expression of this yearning for identity. Now, I'm not taking anything away from the fact that you create tribal conditions where we become smaller and smaller tribes that are trying to exert our meaning on the world. And I'm not making the case that the internet is responsible for all the violence here. No, no.
No,
But
I'm not interpreting
yeah,
that way. Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think it bears thinking about. This isn't going to end well. This is the collapse, for me, the collapse of liberal, secular, pluralistic democracy is almost directly related to two things: globalization and the internet.
Well,
And I
and they
mean,
go
I'm
and they
writing
go
about
hand
this,
in hand.
so yeah.
And they go hand in hand. It's funny because a lot of science fiction writers have said this. Have written this. A lot of futurists have said this, that if you really look at the history of humanity, we can, in some ways, the only thing that would ever let humanity ever truly unite against itself in the kind of way that we are now is if there is an other, and that is like an alien of some kind. So we say, oh, there's the human race, so it doesn't matter if you're black or Asian or whatnot. Okay, at least we're all the same biology, and we're fighting this other group because that it's like that is what speaks to our, I don't know, our biology, the way we are, whatever. It's like we almost have to have that other. And so, and it's almost like, but of course, if we ever were to encounter an alien race, it would probably be our undoing completely. And I'm sorry, everyone that's listening, you probably thought we were going to be talking about Tinder and OkCupid and kind of how to figure out like how to do this. But those while they're important concepts, and I would love to talk about those with any of you. For in full disclosure, everyone, I met my lovely wife, the person that I love more than anything in this world. I met her on an online dating app. So it's like, if it weren't for the internet, I would be unemployed. I would be single. I would be miserable. I wouldn't be able to talk to somebody like Ashok. I wouldn't be able to keep up with my parents or anything, of course. But then I would never have come to India to begin with, Ashok. I discovered you through
Absolutely.
the internet. So the irony is just like fire. It can cook our meals and create our glass and do everything that we want it to do, but then it can also burn down our homes and destroy the earth. And so it's this is technology in a nutshell.
And this is where you are far more balanced than I am, because I don't square with the fire analogy at all. But that's for another conversation. We are coming to the end of the session. Michael, as always, you're one of my colleagues from MetaCulture that I have always enjoyed shooting the breeze with. And it's because you're a sincere thinker. And I just want to acknowledge that the reason why you're special for me is because you're not posing, and you're not driven by an agenda about what you want, either for your career or what you want from me or anyone else. You are willing to struggle with complex ideas, even if it makes you uncomfortable. Thank you very much, Michael, for being my guest here. I look forward to bringing you back on the show another time. So now,
Thank you.
before we leave, I just want to put out that we have two courses coming up. And because we don't have any other way of advertising, I do hope that if you are really interested in delving deeper into any of these topics, the the Demo Sapien Democracy course will actually really help you understand and question many of your assumptions about how the world works. It's really about how civilization works. And then the critical thinking course is at its root. How can we make this biological mass that we call the brain into a finely tuned instrument called the mind? It's literally the evolution from brain to mind. I am very, very excited about this. Um, if you are interested, please contact me, Ashok at MetaCulture Studio, or you can also write to coordinator@metaculture.studio, and we will send you information. Do spread the word. If you like this conversation, if you are interested in being a part of these conversations, write to me. I do not just invite anyone. My emphasis, what I'm looking for in a guest, is the capacity to move beyond ego and to really grapple with questions and to be vulnerable and to talk about the serious things that we all grapple with without trying to persuade, without trying to advocate, and so that we can learn from each other. We are not trying to be sexy. We are not trying to be stimulating. We are not trying to create fireworks here. I'm using this infernal technology that I really don't like in order to create opportunities for slow, deliberate, gentle conversations. I know it sounds weird, but it's the technology that we have now, and I will use it. And I welcome you to be part of that. Thank you so much, everyone.